Please welcome Boz Scaggs. Well, Boz, you know, we were just listening to Memphis, as I said, and we were even talking a little bit about Memphis before we came out here. Talk about going there, you know, to make this record. You know, it's an album that, you know, takes its title from a city and, you know, means, I think, to evoke something about the music that was created there. And so talk about that a bit.
We didn't intend to do any kind of retrospective of Memphis or to really feature the city in any sense of as to its history or what had happened there. And we didn't draw from classic Stax or High Records material. We just went there primarily because of the studio. It's called Royal Studios, and it was run and by Willie Mitchell, who was a great mentor to many musicians and, quite frankly, inspired both Steve Jordan, the producer, and myself to a lot of musical heights through the years. And we were, I guess, looking for a room that had a built-in sound. And among the things that we were considering at the time were Muscle Shoals in Alabama, and there was a great studio in Atlanta, Georgia, and there's a studio in Philadelphia, and studios that were part of a record company where a lot of work went on, and a studio that had a built-in sort of sound that was distinctive. I had worked at this studio in Memphis, Royal Studio, as had my cohort, Steve Jordan. And quite independently, we thought of, and then first choice recommended to each other that we go to Memphis and make this record. As it turned out, the city had a very powerful influence on what happened, particularly the studio and the people around it. But through the course of making this record, which I will tell you now lasted all of 5 days, it was a powerful force upon us. There is an unspoken wave of energy in that city that weighs and influences heavily the kind of music that we like to make. We knew we wanted to make a rhythm and blues record. Other than that, it was wide open. We chose the musicians and the place. But Memphis had a powerful role in it.
You know, when I should mention also that I think it just came out this week, actually. There's a 2-CD essential Boz Scaggs set that just came out, which, you know, covers everything, you know, from back in the 60s right up through, there's one track from Memphis on there. Happened to write the liner notes for that, interviewed Boz for it. And, you know, during that conversation, you know, when you were talking about the album Memphis, you said, you know, that it took 5 days to make, but it took a lifetime to get there. And I wonder if you could just expand on that a little bit and, you know, talk about what that lifetime was.
Well, it was almost just a cliche, but it was a Zen-like experience. All we knew was, I'll speak of the we being Jordan and myself, with whom I felt a great musical affinity. Steve Jordan is a drummer, producer, works with a lot of people. We crossed paths a dozen years ago in a project, and I think the notion was became lodged in each of our minds that we wanted to do something together, and this was the occasion. And all we knew was that we were going to meet in this studio. We gave ourselves 10 days we, in an almost uncanny sense, arrived at the same cast of characters, that is, the musicians and the engineers we wanted to work with. And, you know, sometimes these convergences work and sometimes they don't. But we sort of threw all the ingredients in, and it was there was no trial run and there were no demos. We just landed at the same time and showed up at the appointed hour in the studio and hit it. And it worked. It really worked. And I think after just a couple of takes, we realized that we had arrived at a good gumbo, and that anything could happen and anything could work. So that kind of thing only comes out of a lot of background and a lot of sort of sort of mysterious insights and some really good luck. So we had given ourselves at least 10 days to cut the tracks. We ended up finishing in 3 days. And on the 4th day, we put on some horns and some strings and went out for some barbecue and went home. And it couldn't have been anything other than what it was. It couldn't have been more enjoyable and relaxed, and it couldn't have been more meaningful, or it couldn't have been anything more or less than what it was.
You know, the music on the record is so completely in the pocket. I mean, when you listen to it, it just, you know, we just heard Rainy Night in Georgia, and, you know, just it really just sounds like, you know, someone's speaking to you. You know, there's such a kind of great intimacy to your performance there. You know, there's other tracks on there, Love on a Two-Way Street. You know, could you talk about, you know, kind of interpreting songs like that? You know, they're kind of lodged in people's imaginations. At the same time, there's obviously a way to come to it, and without any contrivance, make it sound immediate and make it sound emotionally fresh in some way. I wonder if you could just talk about your approaching the material like that.
Well, first off, the song will speak back to you right away, or not. You can make lists and think of great songs, and you can check yourself out emotionally and go by your personal history and artists you like and songs that really moved you. But it really comes out when you try the song out. I came into the habit or the process a few years ago of finding songs that I like. I think you and I discussed this to some extent. I've been working with Mike McDonald and Don Fagen in this collaboration in which we've examined hundreds and hundreds of songs. And the way you get beyond the suggestion of the song is you make a little demo for yourself, and you put it in your own key, and you maybe change the tempo or the feel a little bit to give to personalize it a little. And then you sing into a microphone in your own little demo way. And the song will either feel good and speak back to you or not. It either agrees with your style and your own way of reinterpreting it, or it doesn't. So the material had no real criteria other than being something that felt good and something that you could possess and own and give some of your own character to. A great song, as is the case, I think, with many of the songs of the American standards, the Great American Songbook, give back a great deal to a lot of singers. Just across the board, so many people have taken that material on and reinterpreted it, and it just, there's a chemistry and a structure and a harmonic exchange that goes on that lets you own those pieces very, very easily sometimes. It's not necessarily so with the songwriter tradition from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and a lot of we did pop materials, R&B material, some blues material. But sometimes a song, you mentioned the Tony Joe White song, Rainy Night in Georgia, actually takes on a different nuance and a different staging almost by changing the tempo a little bit, even changing the key. The mood can change very, very, very graphically. And if it speaks in a unique way, that is, when you play it back or when you play it with the other players, you've got something you can work with. And we tried randomly a good 20 or 30 songs, and in thinking of the context we were moving into, these 12 or 14 songs just came back to us and seemed in some ways almost like different songs.
You know, one of the other, I think, real kind of standout tracks on the album is New York Boy, Willie DeVille, Mixed Up, Shook Up Girl. And, you know, it's a song that, you know, isn't necessarily, you know, part of that R&B tradition. On the other hand, it fits so nicely on the record. I wonder if you could talk about, you know, that particular track and approaching it.
Willie DeVille captured my imagination with his first record long ago, early 70s. And it was a bit of a stretch for me, or it was a little bit across the way. It was New York. It was very New York to me. It was very streetwise.
Queen of Avenue D and this kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And it came straight out of the great doo-wop street stoop a cappella tradition of New York. It sounds to me like, and in that way, it was just a beauty of a piece. And that album and his version of his vocalizing of that tune have just stuck with me over the years. And when I started just throwing things up against the wall and seeing what stuck in this context, two of Willie's songs actually made the cut and have seen
Cadillac Girl,
Cadillac Walk was
yeah,
one, and Mixed Up, Shook Up Girl, and they turn out to be two of the really most accessible rock and pieces that we looked at and recorded. So.
You know, we talked. I mean, in discussing these songs, obviously we're discussing interpretation, and you know, obviously, you're a very accomplished songwriter of many years. At the same time, as you're also, you know, a really gifted, you know, interpretive singer. And I wonder, you know, in the post-Dylan world, you know, it sort of seemed like that idea of interpretation was something that got kind of shunted aside a little bit, and you know, everybody was meant to write their own material and write all of it, and if you were quote unquote just a singer, that wasn't a kind of a rock and roll thing to be. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you can, you know, talk about, you know, that interplay between material that you write yourself and songs that that other people have written that you want to interpret, and you know what you feel is you know, the artistry of each approach.
Well, the tradition was, I think, in the time that I grew up with radio in the 50s and 60s. So I was hearing, you know, pop material from the top 10 in America, and I was hearing leftovers from the 30s and the 40s and the 50s in show tunes and what was the American songbook. And that music was really written to be universal and express a more universal emotion, I guess. Then along came our generation and Dylan and the more personalized music, country music too, was very personal. Hank Williams and the other great Americana stars that were coming out were actually, I guess, in saying what I'm saying, they were more in character with the Great American Songbooks. But this personalized approach to songwriting took the, let's say, the skill out of vocalizing. It was assumed that the old adage was, or the old show business thing was, it's all about the singer and the song. Given the right A&R pick, you could pair up this singer and that song, and you're gonna, take your ride into the charts. That all changed, and when the rock and roll generation came along, it became more of a stylistic interpretation in a different way. And I think the real craft of singing, the control and the timing and the stylization of a song got lost or just was de-emphasized in the 60s and the 70s. It had more to do with your own personal way of recreating the energy, but not so much in terms of how you could actually use the voice as an instrument. And perhaps as the 70s and 80s and 90s, as songwriting, as the business itself looked for, the thrill or the contact, it was those groups and those people who invented their own little niche and style. Meanwhile, there really is a beautiful art and craft of vocalizing, and I just think that's not so important. It's as it was in another era. Songs are not written for that. That kind of that kind of style or strength still comes through, but it's not priority like other kind of aspects of an important song.
Well, one area in which it really has kind of never gone away in many ways is R&B. I mean, those songs, obviously you're supposed to sing those songs. I mean, there isn't that kind of sense of, I think in a lot of, just broadly speaking, like white singer-songwriters, there was a sense of, if you wrote it, you can sing it. It's like your own personal voice, whatever it was appropriate for your own material. Whereas, in R&B, there still was a kind of standard of, you had to get up there and sing next to, people who really were singing. And, it seems like a kind of a lot of the music that you historically have always been drawn to, I wonder if you could talk about, some of the first, kind of soul and R&B things that you heard maybe when you were growing up that, that really reached you and helped shape your musical sensibility.
I think I have to say right up front, most everything that really moved me was from the black side of the radio dial. I grew up in small town Oklahoma and Texas, and although I had access to same top 40 that was playing everywhere, and the same sounds coming out of Philadelphia on American Bandstand, and I had access to the rhythm and blues of Texas and New Orleans, and after a certain hour at night, these big radio stations out of the South, and jazz out of Chicago, and deep soul out of all places. Like Nashville was a hotbed of, and Memphis we could get on the radio. So that was in the mix, and I think I personally, when I spun the radio dial, if I heard a steel guitar, I couldn't get it off the airwave fast enough. So I missed the whole. Bob Dylan introduced me years later to the music that was really all around me in Texas. But I just I liked the soul that came out of New Orleans and Houston and San Antonio, and as well as doo-wop. I was greatly influenced by Pat Stomino and Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, and a whole world of stuff that it just moved me. I think that as I listened to that stuff, I had access to some of it. There were live shows and reviews that came through Dallas, which was the closest city to the little town I grew up in. And I got to see Ray Charles when I was about 14 years old. And I don't know how it works really neurologically. I was rewired that night, and I've been trying to get high like that again ever since. It transformed me. It was a lightning bolt that changed the way I perceived the world.
What did you hear? I mean, what did you hear? What did you see? What happened? You know?
I heard, this was about 1958, 59 perhaps. It was at a place called the State Fair Auditorium, a 3,000-seat auditorium in Dallas. And there were 2,998 black people, and the white guy who drove me and myself drove me in to see the show. And I was unaware of anything really but Ray Charles's band. They came out. It was the Ray Charles Big Band with Hank Crawford and Fathead Newman and an all-star jazz ensemble who came out and just cooked for 15 or 20 minutes. And Ray came out, and the energy in the room was palpable. At some point in the evening, I remember looking up in the first balcony and saw people like dancing on the rail of the balcony, and it was an ecstatic thing. The music, it was the height of Ray's hits, What I Say, and I Got a Woman, and the big band stuff, and I knew all the songs, but there it was, palpable and live and in the air, and it was electric. At one point in the evening, during one of the ballads, and I'd say for anyone who knows Ray's material, it might have been a song called "It Brings a Tear to My Eye." One of those songs. There was a young, a young black woman who was my age, probably, next to me. And she grabbed my arm and squeezed it and held it tight, and she was really locked onto me. She had no idea that she was doing that. I hadn't no idea how much I would love someone to grip me like that.
Sure.
With this music going on. But it was a powerful experience. And,
well, you know, you went sort of traveling for a while, you know, while you were young, before you did some recording in Europe, and you know, was that just you know, the kind of normal kind of young person finding himself? But you at that point were, you know, pretty serious about your music as well. You know, talk about going to Europe and what brought you there, and you know, some of the stuff you did over there.
It was a time in, let's see, I must have been about 19 years old. And I had been playing music on the weekends. I actually enrolled in the University of Wisconsin in Madison and attended a few classes, but mostly I was playing fraternity parties and working shows and having a great time. I had migrated to Austin, Texas, and knew some musicians down there, and we were playing rhythm and blues. It was a horn band in Austin, Texas, and the Stones and the Beatles records were first hitting America. Must have been 1963 or 4, and we had this wild notion that we were going to London with. We were hearing the music that we were hearing that we were playing in Texas, coming out of London, with the early English bands, the Stones and John Mayall and the Blues Breakers and so forth were playing that stuff. So we decided to go to London and try our luck. And so 2 other musicians and myself made the trip, and we stayed in London for 6 or 8 weeks, and we had a kind of a manager, and we tried to get our foot in the door, and mostly it was just an eye-opening experience. The musical part of it was a mind blower, to hear the same songs that we were hearing out of Houston and Dallas clubs being played by these young dudes in London was incredible. They were playing with great proficiency the original stuff, Bobby Bland and B.B. King and so on. And we never really got a foot in the door. The two guys I went with became discouraged and went back to Texas. And I stayed on for a while, and they just started traveling. And I ended up staying in Europe and just being sort of a Dharma bum kind of character for 2.5 or 3 years. Went on to the Middle East and made that journey to India and Nepal and Afghanistan, and eventually migrated back to Stockholm, where I was based for a couple of years. And it was at the time when I was 20, 21, 22 years old, and I think probably kind of an important formative time in anybody's life, but I think it very much influenced the way I approached a lot of things after that.
Well, and one of the next stages on your journey was kind of reconnecting with Steve Miller, who had, I guess you had met in Madison, is that correct? Or
we actually went to high school together.
Oh, you did?
In Dallas. I started going to a high school in Dallas, living in this small town. I commuted into town, and it was at that time that I met Steve and started playing music. And
what was your sense about him, back then? And then, obviously, you kind of reunited in San Francisco, and made a couple of records as part of the Steve Miller Band. Could you talk about kind of what kind of motivated you to do that, and kind of what you feel about, obviously, that period in San Francisco was kind of a seminal moment. Talk about what that was like.
Well, I went back. I was aware of the scene. I remember being in Bombay and seeing a Time magazine that had pictures of all the American kids dressed up like cowboys and Indians and painted up, and the same sort of youth revolution was going on all over Europe and in America and elsewhere. But the American version of it was there was a lot of music, and I think it was to some degree, musically, it was reaction to the British young musicians who were starting their own bands and reproducing, great American music. anyway, I had a friend who was the brother of Jorma Kalkinen from Jefferson Airplane, who lived in Stockholm, and he was going back and forth between and bringing me back the latest records and the latest music from San Francisco. And I was somewhat aware of the scene and curious about it. I myself had been missing playing in bands, playing that blues and R&B music, which I loved and which I'd grown up with. I had my musical experience in Europe and a pretty strong little scene in Stockholm, but it was different. I missed digging into that bluesy stuff. And it was about that time that Steve Miller had started a band and been active in San Francisco for a couple or 3 years with what he called the Steve Miller Blues Band, of which one of the members fell out, and Steve had gotten my address from my parents and sent me a letter to American Express in Stockholm, which I picked up. And the letter said, would you like to come back to San Francisco, and mentioned the band member who he'd like me to replace. And so Steve knew my work from having, our having worked together, and just wanted me to fill in. Offered me a round trip plane ticket. And I was curious about the scene, and I missed playing, and I knew Steve well, and knew it would be a solid musical experience. So I came to San Francisco, and sure enough, the band was very solid, and Steve is a very professional guy, and it was a real nice scene. It was a bit shocking to me. I mean, I wasn't new to the scene, but the the way it was happening in San Francisco was just wild to me. I mean, I knew about the be-ins and the sit-ins and I knew a number of musicians actually who had migrated out of New York and Chicago, but it was just the wildest, most kind of wonderful and kind of silly, and but the music was great, and I was there for 9 or 10 months. I did my part with Steve's band, and had the opportunity to go into the studio on a very high professional level with a great producer and in some great studios. Our first album was made in London, the second one was made in LA, and it was really that was the turnover for me. It really pushed me into knowing a little direction. I was writing my first songs and getting some studio experience, so it was a seminal event for me and the Times.
You ended up, and you kind of ended up, getting interested in obviously kind of recording your own songs yourself around that time, and ended up going to Muscle Shoals to work, and with Jan Wenner, mm-hmm. is kind of co-producing the album, mm-hmm. and Jan, the editor and founder of Rolling Stone, and someone that you knew from San Francisco.
He was my neighbor. He was my across the street neighbor, and he shared. Jan was extremely enthusiastic about music. He had been mentored by the great Ralph Gleason, and who was an important music guy out of Berkeley, and but Jan loved music, and it was the love of music and journalism which had him moving toward that thing that became Rolling Stone magazine. And so we shared enthusiasm across the street and became great friends. And he encouraged me after I had left the Steve Miller Band to write my own stuff, and he did. He was the, as you say, he produced my first record and was the sort of classic producer in that sense. He found me, he encouraged me, he listened to my tapes, he put a collection together. He was at that time coming to New York for the first time and meeting important record people, and as a part of his thing, he was saying, I know this guy in San Francisco who was with the Miller Band, and he brought my new music to some people, well, notably Jerry Wexler at Atlantic Records, and opened the doors for me, and went on to help me find the place and the musicians to record with, and that enthusiasm carried both of us right into my first record, and again, it just lit the way in a way.
You know, I mean, obviously, this is sort of like a journey of kind of cultural hotspots in a way. You know, the Muscle Shoals studio players, you know, kind of legendary. You know, among them at that time, you know, of course, Duane Allman was there. You know, could you talk about just, you know, recording in that environment and, you know, Duane Allman and what he was like?
I was really lucky to get to work with Duane, because he had actually left the session scene about 6 months before. I had kind of studied a lot of the material that came out of Memphis and Muscle Shoals, and Jerry Wexler had encouraged me to go down to Memphis and Muscle Shoals and to Atlanta, Georgia, to check out some studios. So the preparation for that trip was to listen to a lot of stuff, and Duane stood out notably as a real a star musician among the great session players. And it turned out that Duane was no longer going to be available, because he had been encouraged to put together his own band, which became the Allman Brothers. But through Jan, he met Duane's and the Allman Brothers manager, and developed some interest in the project, and talked to Duane about it. And Duane sort of knew me from the Steve Miller Band. Anyway, it so happened that Duane came back, and it was something of a reunion, and with the session guys. Duane was a hero to them, and a real sort of a great guy, a brilliant guitar player, and really sort of a star to those guys as well. So when he came to Muscle Shoals to join the session, it was something of a reunion. It was something of a celebration having him there, and I think his energy really provided that record. And but Muscle Shoals itself was just a pure joyous experience. A simple room, great ambience, really sweet, wonderful, generous, talented young guys, and who gave you everything they had. And the songs, you know, you'd go in the morning and play a demo, or sit down and play your guitar or piano or whatever you had, and then watch them take it in and give it their treatment. And just one song after another came out, and you know, remarkably cohesive, and they found the finer points, and they did it for everybody that worked for them, week after week after week, and it became a mecca for a lot of us.
You know, and as the you know, kind of as the '70s rolled in, you know, there was you became, sort of one of the, you know, kind of preeminent figure during that time. The R&B of that era was something that obviously, kind of caught your ear and that you kind of felt very strongly. This kind of beautiful, very melodic, but still rhythmically driven, almost kind of orchestral R&B. And you were playing, you were working with great musicians, and among other great records, you had your album Silk Degrees, which was a huge success. Talk about that moment where suddenly the music that you're making becomes that big and that popular, and that much kind of a part of the cultural fabric at that point.
Well, there never really was a moment. I think if it had been my first or second record, or it might have been quite an explosive moment, but it was my sixth or seventh or eighth record, and I'd been working really hard to take those, to work, to write songs and to keep my band together, and it was really just another record in a series. And I think that I had lost some amount of, I wasn't a freshman going into that, at that stage, and I had high hopes before. I think everybody who makes a record believes in what they're doing and is trying to reach a broader audience, and feels like at the end of a project that you've done it, and you really want people to see it, you want the world to appreciate it. And 99.9% of the time, it doesn't reach the high heights that you might have hoped or dreamed about. So I'd had a number of those experiences. Not to say that I wasn't having some success. I was working, I was enjoying my music, I was able to keep my band together, and I was selling some decent number of records for Atlantic Records and for Columbia Records. But that record, Silk Degrees, I felt was somehow special and important in the making. I felt like I had arrived at a place, and yet when the record came out, it really didn't find an immediate audience. It really didn't come on the scene with any. We put out a single and it got some play here and there, as I'd had happen before. It was only 6, 8, 10 months into it that it kind of exploded. I had been out working. I took the guys I had recorded with on the road with me, and we went out and did the usual rounds. But after 6 or 7 or 8 months, something started happening. It was actually, in fact, a hit on R&B radio in Cleveland. It became a sort of a local dance hit, and the promotion guys at Columbia Records saw that and started moving it to other R&B stations around the country. Then it caught on Top 40 and then went ballistic and stayed on the charts for a couple of years. At that point, we were just working, and it meant to us more gigs, some new amps, bigger audience, a little more comfortable traveling, a little more comfortable transportation, and it was work, and I was thankful and grateful, but it wasn't that. There wasn't that moment. It was
I don't
one
want the
step
brown
at a time.
M&Ms. It wasn't that.
No, not at first.
You went on a very nice run, and then kind of at the beginning of the '80s, you began to really kind of step back out of the scene, and I think at one point, when we were talking for the liner notes of that, Essential Boz Scaggs record, you said, I thought I would take 6 months off, and it lasted about 5 years. I wonder if you could, just kind of describe that, that process a little bit.
Well, I guess it had been building for a time. There was a 4 or 5 year period that was, it seemed that my time was not my own anymore. It was all about me, but it was really not about my time. There were the shows to do, and there was another record to make always, and there were more songs to write, and there were publicity demands. And it was a pretty fast-moving and powerful locomotive going down the track at that point. And in 1980, I did a world tour. I had released the third album of a series of LA big productions, and had a greatest hits album. I had a movie soundtrack hit song come out. And it looked like a good time to step out for a minute and catch my breath, take care of some things on the home front, and get a little rest. It was all out there, and cooking seemed like a time where I could duck behind the scenery for a minute. And that 6 months went very quickly, and I don't even think I was aware that it had passed. And I felt sort of guilty for a while, because I'd been so used to satisfying the various professional stuff that came out, that was coming about. But I got over it in a way, and I've likened the experience to having jumped off a fast-moving train and finally rode to a stop and watched that train go off in the distance. And I just didn't care in that way that I felt that I had to go catch up with it again. I thought I was sort of just catching up with a little of the reality around me, which was a young family and other interests, frankly. And I told myself probably every day, and then every week, and then every month, that I was going to go back and start the demos and start writing and putting another studio project together. But it just wasn't there. In a way, the music itself had left me. There were no songs in my head. There was nothing calling me, and I just couldn't manufacture anything. I had made money. I didn't have to go to work anymore. I kept thinking, well, it will come to me, and music will come back into inspire me and make me want to go out. But I didn't want to go out and do shows. I didn't want to go in the studio. I didn't have anything. And I think in retrospect, I feel like in a way I perhaps, I don't know, betrayed the music that was in me. I think I scared the muse away. And I felt music is almost a sacred thing to me. And if it's not coming to me, and it's not there, and if it's not that song that's going around my head day after day, night after night, then I have nothing to draw upon. And I guess I thought that I could wait till it came back, or perhaps it wouldn't come back. And it was, in fact, 7, 8, 9 years later that I started to get the bug. I actually put out a record 8 years later, in 1988, and that was followed 3, 4, 5 years later by another one. And then it started coming back. I had went through a personal life change, and just kind of had different priorities when the music started coming back to me. And in some ways, I credit that the ability to get away from it all when I had to, when I needed to the way I feel about it today, which is.
Yeah, I think there's a real through line from, I guess, maybe the Some Change record in in the early '90s, through Memphis, through I think pretty much everything you've done since then, and it's kind of like a highly individual projects that you seem very kind of reflective of you as a person at that particular moment. I wanted to just get to one more question before we look at some of the questions from the audience, and that is, you briefly alluded to the kind of Great American Songbook records that you did, a few years back, and I remember talking to you about them, and was very struck by the degree to which, you felt that engaging that material really affected you as a singer, and I wondered, I wonder if you could describe how exactly, what exactly took place for you as an artist.
Well, a couple of things come to mind. One, I feel there's a responsibility to those songs. In the same way I was speaking about the songs of the recent album, if you can't bring something original, a valid reinterpretation, or something to do those songs justice, they don't really belong in your work. So, when I was researching material, you look at an important standard, and you hear Nat King Cole's version, or Sinatra's version, or Chet Baker's version, or Ella Fitzgerald's version, or Billie Holiday's version, and you're stepping into some heavy stuff, and the beauty of those songs is that they can be reinterpreted in so many ways. So you're in line to try to find your own approach to them, and it's tricky. Again, finding your own expression in those, and that tricky stuff is really kind of a puzzle, and you become, in that way that we were talking earlier, you have to become more of a stylist. You don't just toss off a vocal on those songs. There's some melodies that have to be respected, and there's some harmonics that have to be obeyed. And there are stylistic devices which you have to acquire, because you are now an instrument. You're no longer, Bob Dylan or Joni Mitchell or Boz Scaggs or whoever that may be. You're the instrument, and this is all you've got. You're a saxophone, you're a piano, you're a drum, all of a sudden. And I think really, or let's say, I felt I needed to step up to that responsibility, and that's very real to me. I found it the most challenging musical thing I ever took on, and in the context that it came to me, which was, there was a jazz quartet that was recording in a studio in San Francisco. That it was my studio. I let them come in and take whatever time they needed to make their own album. They befriended me, and it was they who asked if I had ever sang any of these songs, and asked me to try a song with them. And in my world, jazz musicians are way up here. They occupy a space that not many other musicians in my domain really have. They're the big guys, the real guys, and working with them, of course, was a challenge to me. And so it was over a period of 2 or 3 years, really, that they let me into their circle, and I had occasion during that time to sing a couple of songs in live with audiences, and in clubs, and in a couple of auditorium performances. That the feeling was amazing and electric, to be be a pure instrument as opposed to being a personality. that was the uniqueness of that situation. I got off the question. I got away from the question, perhaps.
I think you got to it. You know, we were talking about just what the impact of engaging that material just on you as a singer, and I think that pretty much told the story.
Good, yeah.
Well, we have a couple. Before we take the questions, we have a raffle moment here. As you know, you'll be able to purchase signed CDs after when the conversation is done, and but we've got 3 to raffle off here, and so Boz, why don't you pick a number here?
Anthony and I are going out for dinner tonight, and we really appreciate your. No,
Exactly.
This is for the cause. This is for PBS. Number 100.
Okay.
Number 100, number 134, and 135.
Oh, you picked 3. You got. There you go.
I think that was the deal, wasn't it?
Oh, okay. Yeah, 3 is good.
We were talking backstage. So
Good. Let's leave those out so
okay.
we can make sure that they match whenever it is that people get their CDs. No, yes. I'm sorry. Pick one more. Okay. I'll go this time.
Go ahead.
Okay, B10. Oh no, I'm sorry. 113. Okay. No brawling here. Well, these are all very good, huh? All right. Let's start with this one. Share with me, says Miss P. Share with me the most important song in your body of work and why.
I would have to say that the song "Lowdown" from the album "Soaked Degrees" was a kind of a remarkable experience writing, and I've performed that song in more various occasions, more varied occasions than anything I've ever been called upon to do. It seems to fit. It's the most natural range of my voice. It's the easiest groove. The lyrics have rung true. What is it, the old lyric? Anyway, I won't digress. The song is true, the song is you, I think is the name. But yeah, it just has followed me. I love to sing it every time I sing it. I get a lot of requests for it. I collaborated with a fellow named David Page on that song. He's one of my greatest, a musical brother, and I'm really proud of that song. Thanks for asking. Yeah.
When you say a song speaks back to you, what do you specifically look for in a song that makes you want to record it?
Well, there's a lot. I like a lot of songs. I like the melodies, and I like the chord changes, and I really like the vocal performances. Those are the things that I first look at, and that's sort of that's an objective process, and it's only when you take it upon yourself to make it a subjective process. When you try it out, you take it out for a test ride. You sing it, and it's been quite surprising to see how much I can love a particular song as done originally, perhaps by someone like Ray Charles or Bobby Blue Bland. A song that I have sung to myself, sing in the shower, whatever. I've loved that song, and I try to do it myself, and I cannot find the vehicle. I can't maneuver it. My voice won't go there. My expression won't go there. And then other songs or other things just do seem to fit. I do have a voice for it. I do have the means for it. and the lyrics start taking on a new meaning to me, or it becomes a vehicle for me. That's the way a song speaks to you. You have a little insight into that writer and even to that artist who interpreted it, perhaps, but it becomes yours. You feel it from the inside out.
This is a good New York question and sort of observation. I was lucky enough to see you perform in New York City in July of 1977, Avery Fisher Hall. Yes, the Blackout Show, that band. This last question is a little bit broad. I'll try to just narrow it a little bit. Can you comment on the players that you worked with, kind of around that time, and how did they, what kind of influence did they have on you?
Well, that's a time when I discovered I was a band guy for some years, and then I evolved into out of a band guy. I just wasn't finding I wasn't finding a voice in the band with the songs that I was writing. It was at a point in my career I went back to I'd made half a record, and the other half wasn't coming. And the producer, a friend, said to me, he said, "I love what you did on your first record at Muscle Shoals, and there's something there that clicks for you. I think that you should consider going back to Muscle Shoals with this material that I'm hearing, and seeing if you could find some footing there." I did, and that was when I sort of changed horses and was looking for another way to go forward with my music. The next album I made with a producer and with studio musicians in LA after the Muscle Shoals, which was a successful re-experience. I got my footing in LA in the studio scene with a record called Slow Dancer, and in some ways it was a great discovery and a terrific experience to hear my songs interpreted by major great players in a studio setting, and work with an arranger and a producer who were really giving dimension and new coloration to my own ideas. In doing that, I became more familiar with a broader array of studio guys, and it was when I found this little unit of guys that helped me make the Silk Degrees record and go on the road with it that my career was transformed. And they gave me a great deal of experience. They brought a lot to my material. They read my mind. They read my soul in some ways, and gave it back in such a way that I loved it. I reached that broader audience. I took that other step that all artists are trying to take. That they gave me a connection. They gave me a footing that really set my career, my artist path in motion. I've said it time and time again in interview situations that I owe a great deal to those musicians, and I have always put that aspect of making records first and foremost. I choose the musicians before I even choose the material. They're so important to the way I develop what I do.
Will there ever be a Steve Miller blues band reunion?
Gee, I don't know. Steve and I shared a very important part of each other's development. those early years are in some ways the most meaningful and the most important. And I will always credit Steve as being, he was a very forward-thinking guy in my little world in Texas. He saw a little broader horizons than I did for a period of time, and he mentored me in a certain way and gave me a vision. We shared that experience, but we also came to see each of our individuality through that collaboration. By that I mean I discovered a number of things that I won't do in music, and he discovered a number of things that he won't do in music, and we butted heads, and that was, you know, like the little rams in the forest doing this against each other for a while, and that was important. We were a number of years with the same music in the same band, on the same bandstand, on the same stage. And when we got to a certain point of our, you know, individual development, we learned by butting heads, I think, to some extent, that a little bit what our own directions were. I think that Steve and I still have that commonality, that blues background that would, you know, that we could walk onto a bandstand and pick up right where we left off years ago. Whether that ever happens again, I don't know. Life is long, life is short, and it could happen. But no, I don't think either of us would go, you know, thinking that was a, you know, real go-to place, quite frankly.
Well, this might be a nice kind of closing question. Where will your search for musical expression take you next, or where would you like it to take you?
I'll go back to my thing about work about musicians. I love being in the company and collaborating with lots of musicians, with great stylists, and I think that's what's taken me into the, you know, a little bit into the jazz realm. It's taken me into this collaboration I have with Mike McDonald and Don Fagan. It's taken me into collaboration with Steve Jordan, who I made this most recent record with. I have a lot of respect, and there's a lot of musicians out there that I really like working with. I've worked probably more the last 3 or 4 years than I have at any point in my career, and I've enjoyed it more. And in doing that, let's say, for instance, I've crossed paths a few times in the last 6 months with a band like Los Lobos and found a great commonality. I'd love to do something with them. You know, I hear the musicians around me that I'd love to work with, and I think that's probably going to determine as much as anything where I go. I'm still finding my footing as a guitar player, as a singer, and as a writer, but I love the collaboration with other musicians.
Well, thank you all for coming. You know, Boz has
Thank
some
you.
CDs for sale, and thanks to Boz Scaggs. It's tremendous.
Thank you.